The November night in 1895 was harsh, as the wind howled through the mountain passes and a heavy snowstorm rolled in like an uninvited guest. Rancher Cole Bennett stood in the doorway of his barn, fastening the wooden latch on the final stall of his herd. His fingers were stiff from the cold, and the shadows of dusk already blanketed the sprawling land around his ranch. The old barn creaked under the wind's weight, but Cole didn't mind. It had stood through worse. As he moved to the house, the snow began to fall harder, swirling in thick sheets, nearly blinding him. He pulled his coat tighter and hurried down the path to his home. Just as he reached the door, the sound of a wagon's wheels breaking through the snow caught his attention. A slow, labored clop of hooves followed. He stopped, squinting through the dark as the wagon came into view, struggling up the narrow path toward his ranch. The horses were tired, their breath visible in the biting cold air, steam rising from their flanks. The driver of the wagon, an elderly man, waved his hand weakly. His companion, a woman, was bundled in a shawl, her face barely visible under a thick scarf. Cole stepped forward. "Can I help you?" he called out. The man, leaning heavily on his cane, nodded. "Please, sir, just shelter for the night. Our horses can't go any farther." Cole took a step back, his gaze moving from the frail figures to the wagon behind them, a humble, weathered vehicle, the kind that had been used for many years. He could see that the woman was trembling, her shoulders hunched against the cold. Her cheeks were pale, lips a shade of blue. The man looked weary, too. His face was lined with age and hardship. Yet there was something in their eyes, something dignified despite their circumstances, as if they were used to a life of struggle, but refused to let it break them. The rancher's gut told him to help. Without a second thought, Cole took a deep breath, stepping aside. "Come on inside. Get you out of that cold." The elderly man nodded gratefully, guiding the horses toward the barn. Cole helped the woman off the wagon, supporting her fragile form as they slowly made their way to the warm light spilling from the ranch house. Her hands were icy to the touch. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "You're too kind." Inside, the warmth of the stove greeted them. Cole quickly moved to the kitchen, where a pot of stew simmered over the flames. He had no intention of letting the strangers go hungry, not tonight. As he set out a bowl of steaming venison stew and cornbread, the woman took a seat by the fire, her tired eyes scanning the room as if she were trying to place it. Her gaze rested on the stone fireplace, where the flickering flames illuminated its edges. "This stone," she said quietly, as her hand reached out to touch the cold, weathered surface. "Sweetwater Quarry?" Cole paused, looking at her. "Yes, my father built it. 1876. At this, the old man, Samuel, looked up from his meal, his face somber. He didn't speak for a moment, then added, "We lived in Montana once, long ago." Cole's brow furrowed. "Where?" "Before the winter of 75. Samuel seemed to hesitate, his gaze drifting to the table. "Near here." The woman, Grace, suddenly excused herself, her emotions too heavy to bear. She retreated to the guest room, leaving Cole and Samuel in uneasy silence. As Cole cleaned up, something nagged at him. There was something about the couple that felt too familiar, but he couldn't place it. The snowstorm raged outside, the wind howling like a wolf in the night. When the storm's fury seemed to calm, Cole found himself standing in his study, searching through his father's old trunk. He had to know. His hands trembled as he uncovered a dusty, old property deed dated 1876. His father's handwriting was unmistakable. He had signed this document, this deed that claimed land from the very people who had once called this place home. His eyes ran over the name that appeared there, Chun family, 200 acres, purchased 1873. Cole's stomach twisted. The name wasn't foreign to him. It was the name of the family who had once lived here, the family his father had driven out 2 decades ago. Just then, he heard the floorboards creak. He turned, his heart skipping a beat. Grace stood in the hallway, her eyes fixed on the family portraits hanging on the wall. She looked from one photo to the next, her expression unreadable, but her gaze lingered on one in particular, the one of his father, standing tall and proud, arms crossed on this very land. "You have your father's eyes," Grace whispered softly. "He was there the night they came for us." The words hit Cole like a punch to the gut. His father, the man he'd looked up to, the man who'd taught him how to ride, how to work the land, had been part of something dark, something he could never have imagined. He wanted to speak, to shout, but the words caught in his throat. What would he say to that? Cole closed his eyes, trying to breathe, but the weight of the truth was unbearable. The night was far from over, but already everything had changed. The morning after the storm, Cole awoke with a heaviness in his chest that wouldn't lift. He quietly made breakfast, his hands unsteady as he set the table, placing the old deed between him and the elderly strangers. As Samuel and Grace sat down, Cole's mind kept returning to the revelation from the night before. He could no longer ignore it. The truth needed to be spoken. With a deep breath, he asked, "This land, it was yours, wasn't it?" Samuel's eyes lowered, his face tightening as if the words had been choking him for years. Without speaking, he began to tell the story of how they had come to this land. It was a tale from decades ago, one that Cole had never fully heard. In 1873, Samuel had returned from fighting in the Union Army, and with the pay he'd earned, he had bought 200 acres of land. He had built his home with his own hands, started a cattle ranch, and his wife, Grace, worked as a seamstress, selling her goods to the town. They were part of the community, at least at first. But as the harsh winter of 1875 set in and cattle began dying across the territory, whispers spread among the townsfolk about the Chens. People grew desperate, and soon, those whispers turned into something darker. Samuel's land and his people were blamed for the misfortune, even though there was no proof to support the accusations. It wasn't long before the mob showed up, torches in hand, led by none other than the town sheriff, who stood by but did nothing as they ordered the Chins to leave. "You've got until dawn. Leave or face frontier justice," they were told. And so, with nothing but what they could carry in their wagon, they fled. Watching their cabin burn behind them, their 2-year-old daughter, Lily, crying as they were driven away, was the most painful part of it all. The town had seized the land, declaring it abandoned, and Cole's father had bought it weeks later for a fraction of its worth. Samuel's voice cracked as he said, "Your father wasn't the worst, but he knew. He knew, and he bought it anyway." The next 2 decades were spent moving from place to place, eventually settling in California as laborers trying to rebuild their lives. Grace, now frail, spoke softly about how she never expected to see this land again. She was dying, and they were on their way to Oregon to live with Lily, who had grown up far away from the past. "We just wanted to see it once more," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "To stand on the land we built." Cole's world felt like it was crumbling around him. The man he had idolized, his father, had been complicit in a sin that had haunted these strangers for 20 years. He didn't know how to reconcile the man he had known with the man who had stood by and let this happen. Grace, seeing the turmoil in his eyes, reached out a shaking hand. "We don't want revenge. We're too old, too tired." Samuel nodded, adding, "We just wanted to remember we were real, that we mattered." The weight of the words settled on Cole's shoulders. He stared at the deed again, then looked up, his voice thick with emotion. "Stay, as long as you need. This is still your land." But Samuel shook his head, a sad smile crossing his face. "The town won't allow that. They've spent 20 years forgetting us. Your kindness will cost you everything." Cole sat silently at the breakfast table the next morning, his mind still reeling from the events of the night before. The 2 elderly strangers, Samuel and Grace, had fallen asleep in the guest room, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of what he had just learned. His father's involvement in their suffering weighed heavily on him. How could the man he had looked up to, for all his life, have been a part of such an injustice. The storm had passed, and the cold, crisp air of the Montana morning greeted him as he prepared to take Samuel and Grace into town. His plan was simple: get them the supplies they needed, have their wagon repaired at the blacksmith's, and let Grace visit the general store for a moment of normalcy. But there was a gnawing fear in him, a feeling that whatever they did from here on out would change the course of their lives forever. The town of Copper Ridge was small, but the people there were known for their hard edges and quick judgments, especially when it came to outsiders. As they rode into town, the snow-covered mountains looming behind them, Cole couldn't help but notice the silence that fell over the town when they reached Main Street. The chatter of the usual morning bustle faded, and a heavy tension settled on the street. The townspeople, old and young alike, paused in their activities, their eyes falling on the wagon. Some faces grew pale, while others tightened with anger. It didn't take long for the older generations to recognize Samuel and Grace. Whispers spread like wildfire, passing from one person to the next with terrifying speed. "It's them. It's really them," someone muttered. The younger people were confused, looking to their elders for guidance. "Who are they?" one of the teenagers asked, his voice low. But the answer was already spreading, like a disease through the veins of the town, leaving a trail of shame, fear, and anger in its wake. They were the Chins, the very family that had been driven out of Copper Ridge all those years ago. As they passed the general store, the place that had once been a hub for the community, Grace asked if they could stop for a moment. She wanted to buy some fabric. Nothing fancy, just something simple to pass the time in her remaining days. The moment Grace stepped down from the wagon, Mrs. Patterson, the store owner, froze. The blood drained from her face as her eyes locked onto Grace, recognition flashing in her expression. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, as if the years between them had collapsed, pulling them both back to that terrible night. Mrs. Patterson's hands trembled as she reached for the fabric, but the gesture was forced, not kind. "Grace Chun," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Lord have mercy." The other customers, sensing the change in the air, began to react. Some of them stiffened, their faces contorting into expressions of guilt or hostility, and a few quietly left the store, unable to face the ghosts of the past. But Cole, standing beside Grace, was resolute. He turned to face the room, his voice carrying over the murmurs of discomfort. "These people are my guests," he said firmly. "Treat them with respect." A moment of stunned silence passed before the store quieted, and Mrs. Patterson, with shaky hands, turned to serve Grace, who had now gone quiet, her own emotions hidden behind a veil of years. Outside, the tension in the town had only thickened. It was not just in the store, it was everywhere. At the saloon, where ranchers and townsfolk gathered to discuss business and gossip, the whispers followed them. The moment Cole walked through the door, Wade Pritchard, the cattle baron and town leader, looked up from his drink. Wade was the son of one of the men who had been in the mob that night in 1875, and his eyes darkened when they locked onto Cole's. "You're harboring them Chins?" Wade's voice was low and dangerous, and the other ranchers at the bar looked on, waiting for Cole's response. Cole, feeling the weight of the eyes upon him, didn't back down. "I'm hosting 2 elderly travelers," he said calmly, trying to keep his voice steady. "They need shelter for a night. What's the problem?" Wade stood up from his stool, his face red with anger. "Don't play stupid, Cole. We all know what you're doing. You're helping them come back. You're giving them a place here in this town." His voice raised, and the other men in the saloon murmured their approval. "Your father knew his place, Cole. It's a shame you don't." Cole's fists clenched at his sides. He had heard enough. "My daddy was wrong," Cole said, his voice strong now. "And so were yours." The room fell silent, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. Wade's face twisted with rage, but the other ranchers, sensing the shift, hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like the entire town was holding its breath, watching to see who would stand up for what was right and who would fall in line behind the old ways. But the moment was broken when Cole turned and walked out, leading Grace and Samuel back to the wagon. His voice rang out loud enough for all to hear. "They built this town before we did. They deserve respect." His words echoed down the street as he helped the elderly couple into the wagon. Some people nodded, a small but resolute gesture of support, while others glared at him, their eyes filled with hatred and fear. The town was divided, just as it had been years ago, but now there was a new sense of rebellion in the air. The tension wasn't just in the saloon, it was everywhere, pressing down on the streets like a storm cloud. Later that day, as Cole returned home, the weight of what had happened in town lingered. But there was one more thing that needed to be done. Grace had asked to walk the property, even though the cold was biting. She wanted to see the land, to stand on the ground she had once called home. Cole took her by the arm, helping her make her way across the snow-covered ground. When they reached the place where the cabin had once stood, Grace knelt down, brushing the snow away from the ground, her hands trembling. And there it was, beneath the snow and the earth, an old tin box rusted with age. Inside, Grace found a collection of precious items. Lily's baby blanket, her sewing scissors, the family Bible, and photographs from a life that had been stolen from them. Grace collapsed in a heap, her sobs filling the air. It was as if the weight of 20 years had finally broken free, and the grief that had been buried so long came rushing to the surface. Cole, moved beyond words, gathered her into his arms, holding the memories they had found together. The past had been uncovered, but it had come at a cost. And as they made their way back to the ranch, Cole saw the threatening note nailed to the barn door, a message from the town that had once been his home. Send them away or lose everything. The town remembers. So should you. The words felt like a promise, a warning of what was to come. The town would not let them forget. The town would fight to keep its secrets, and those who dared to defy would pay the price. The morning after the threatening note nailed to his barn door, Cole awoke with a deep sense of dread gnawing at his gut. The note was clear. Either he sent Samuel and Grace away, or he would lose everything. The town had spoken, and its memory was long and unforgiving. But Cole could not bring himself to turn his back on the couple who had shown him so much kindness, even in their suffering. His father's actions, the buying of the Chun family's land, the complicit silence in the face of injustice, had left an indelible stain on his soul. And now, it was up to him to make things right. But the consequences were far greater than he had ever imagined. He knew he had to confront the town, force them to reckon with the truth of their past, and, if necessary, stand alone against the wave of anger and resistance that was surely coming. There was no other choice. He couldn't let the same wrongs continue, not when he had the power to change things. The decision was made. Cole knew he would need help. So, that morning, he rode into town, calling for a meeting. He asked the pastor, Reverend Thomas, to gather the community after Sunday service. The pastor, a kind man, had always been a voice of peace in Copper Ridge, but now, with the town divided, he was reluctant. He had seen the old wounds reopen, and he feared what the confrontation might cost. If the church won't face this, what good is it? Cole had said, looking the pastor square in the eye. It's time to face the truth. After a long pause, Reverend Thomas agreed, though it was clear that the weight of the coming confrontation had already begun to settle heavily on him. The town meeting would take place after the Sunday service, and all were welcome to attend, whether they were ready to listen or not. As Sunday morning arrived, Copper Ridge's church filled quickly. The pews were packed, but the air was heavy with tension. Samuel and Grace, still recovering from their long journey, sat in the back with Cole. There were murmurs as the townsfolk filed in, exchanging glances, whispering to one another. It seemed as if everyone knew something was about to happen, but no one was quite prepared for what was coming. The younger generation, those who had never heard the full story, fidgeted in their seats, wondering why this was suddenly such a big deal. The elders, however, looked down at the pews with grim expressions, their minds locked in the past, still clinging to the same fears that had driven them to act in 1875. Reverend Thomas began the service, but his usual calm demeanor was faltering. His words were hesitant, his voice quivering as he tried to offer comfort, though it was clear he was struggling to find the right words. He chose a sermon about hospitality, about welcoming the stranger with open arms. But the irony of the sermon wasn't lost on anyone. Cole sat in the pew, eyes fixed ahead, trying not to show how deeply he felt the weight of the moment. He could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him, the judgment in their gazes, the fear in their hearts. Some of them had known what had happened in 1875, but others had buried it deep, unwilling to confront their own complicity. As Reverend Thomas spoke, Wade Pritchard, the cattle baron and one of the key figures in the mob that had run the Chins off their land, stood up abruptly. His heavy boots echoed through the church as he strode to the back, pushing past the pews. He didn't look back, but his defiant departure spoke volumes. Others followed him out, some nodding in agreement, some simply too uncomfortable to stay. The church had split right then and there. Those who stayed were clearly torn. Some nodded in silent approval of Wade's departure, while others, their faces marked by guilt, remained seated, unable to look anyone in the eye. As soon as the service ended, Cole stood up, his voice loud and clear as he addressed the congregation. "This land," he began, his voice shaking but determined, "was never truly mine. It was stolen, and I've come to realize that I can't hide from that any longer." He looked over at Samuel and Grace, his heart aching as he saw their tired faces. "These two people, Samuel and Grace Chun, are my guests, but they were also the rightful owners of this land. Their family built this town. They deserve respect, not fear, and they deserve to be remembered." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Wade, who had returned with a group of supporters, spoke up, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're turning your back on your own, Cole. You're siding with them. The very people who were driven out for good reason." "Good reason?" Cole shot back, his voice growing stronger. "There was no good reason. They were forced to leave because of fear and hate. You all know that. You saw it happen, and you let it happen." The room grew quieter, the tension thick in the air. The older men and women who had once known the Chins began to squirm in their seats, unwilling to meet Cole's gaze. But a few brave voices began to speak out. Tom Carter, the blacksmith, stood up, his hands trembling with age, but firm in his words. "I was there," he said, his voice breaking. "I was 25. I watched them burn that cabin. I didn't say a word, but I should have. I've carried that shame my whole life." His wife, an old woman with a steady gaze, stood by his side. "We should have spoken up. We should have done something." Her voice was strong, even in her old age. "We were wrong." One by one, others began to speak out, some apologizing, some simply admitting their shame. But not everyone was ready to face the truth. Wade stood, his jaw clenched, and shouted, "You'll destroy this town, Cole. You'll tear us apart." But Cole didn't flinch. "No," he said, "what we've done for the past 20 years is destroy this town. We've destroyed it by forgetting what happened, by pretending it didn't matter." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm not asking you to forget, but I'm asking you to remember, and to make things right." As Cole finished speaking, the room fell silent. The tension was palpable. Finally, Reverend Thomas stood, his voice steady and calm. "We can't change the past," he said softly, "but we can choose to do right by it now." He turned to the congregation, looking at each face. "We can't undo what happened, but we can make sure it doesn't happen again." The proposal was simple but profound. Return a portion of the land to the Chun family and build a memorial to acknowledge the wrongs that had been done. Some of the younger townspeople, moved by the stories they had just heard, agreed. Others, including Wade and his supporters, loudly protested. But the vote was called. The town was divided, just as it had always been, but in the end, the proposal passed. The memorial would be built and the land would be returned. But the victory came at a cost. That evening, As Cole returned to his ranch, he knew that this decision would change everything. Wade and his followers immediately began to rally against him. The ranchers refused to trade with Cole. His cattle contracts were canceled. The general store stopped supplying his ranch with goods. The message was clear. Cole had chosen to stand with the past, and now the town would make him pay. But Cole didn't care. He had made his decision, and he wasn't going to back down. Samuel and Grace, seeing the turmoil that had followed them, were ready to leave. "We didn't want this," Samuel said quietly. "We didn't want to ruin your life, Cole." But Cole shook his head. "You're not ruining anything. The truth is, and it's long overdue." As the days passed, the town grew colder. Cole received another note. A rider came late one night with a telegram. It was from Lily, Samuel and Grace's daughter. She was coming to Montana, and when she arrived, everything would change once again. The days following the Tenstown meeting were some of the hardest Cole had ever lived through. The divisiveness in Copper Ridge was palpable. Resentment and anger simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. People who had once greeted him with smiles now avoided his gaze, while others watched him with a mix of disdain and fear. Wade Pritchard, having failed to sway the town with his threats, now resorted to more direct methods of intimidation. Cole's ranch was being boycotted. Supplies were scarce, and his cattle contracts were pulled. The town's quiet war against him had begun in earnest. The weather matched the mood, with bitter winds and constant snowfalls turning the landscape into a cold, inhospitable place. The hardest blow, however, came when Cole received word that his cattle were no longer welcome at the local market. It was as if the entire town had turned its back on him, and no one was willing to stand with him. Still, Cole refused to budge. He had made a choice, and it was a choice that was slowly unraveling everything he had worked for. But through it all, he never regretted his decision. He couldn't. His thoughts constantly drifted back to Samuel and Grace, who had come so far, only to be met with the same cold indifference they had faced 20 years ago. The couple had become more than guests in his home. They had become a part of his family, and Cole was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. But as much as he wanted to protect them, he knew there was only so much he could do alone. And then, one evening, a stagecoach arrived. The horses, tired and worn, stumbled through the snow as the coach pulled into Copper Ridge. Cole stepped out of the ranch house, his heart heavy with anticipation, knowing that Lily, the daughter of Samuel and Grace, was coming home. He had heard from Grace and Samuel about their daughter, but he had never met her. She had left the ranch at a young age, after the Chins were driven out of Copper Ridge, and she hadn't returned since. The years had passed, and Lily had built a life for herself in Oregon. But now, her mother was dying, and Lily was coming back to the place her family had once called home. Cole wasn't sure what to expect. The woman who stepped down from the stagecoach wasn't the innocent child who had been torn away from this land all those years ago. She was older now, her features sharp and hardened by the world. She wore a long coat, and her dark eyes flicked nervously from side to side as she took in the familiar yet alien surroundings of Copper Ridge. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened when they landed on her parents. "Why did you bring them back here?" Lily asked, her voice thick with suspicion. Her gaze shifted to Cole, as if he were the one who had caused all this turmoil. Grace, now frail and weak, smiled through her pain and reached for Lily's hand. "We had to, my dear," Grace whispered. "We had to come back just once. This is where we built our family." But Lily wasn't ready to accept it. She hadn't been part of the decision to return to Montana. Her life had been shaped by the absence of her family's history here, and it was easier for her to stay distant from a past that had caused so much pain. For years, she had kept herself busy in Oregon, building a new life, but now, with her mother's illness worsening, she had no choice but to come back and confront the place she had been taken from. It was a land she didn't even remember, a place that had been stolen from her family. "I don't want to be here," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. "It's too painful. I don't even remember it. I don't remember any of it." Cole felt a pang in his chest. He had hoped that Lily would understand, that she would see the sacrifice her parents had made to return to this land. But she wasn't ready. Still, Grace, with all the love she had left, refused to give up on her daughter. "Come with me," Grace said softly, standing as best as she could. "Let me show you where it all began." She led Lily to the land where their cabin once stood. The snow had covered it, but the outline of the foundation stones was still visible under the blanket of white. Grace knelt down, brushing the snow away as she uncovered the memories that had been buried with time. There, in the frozen earth, was an old tin box, rusted and battered but still intact. Grace opened it gently, revealing the treasures inside. Lily's baby blanket, Grace's sewing scissors, the family Bible, and photographs of a life long lost. For a moment, Lily stood there, frozen. She stared at the blanket, her face a mask of disbelief. The memories were slowly flooding back. Memories she hadn't even known she had. Tears welled up in her eyes as she knelt down beside her mother. "I've spent my whole life afraid to belong anywhere," she said, her voice cracking. "Afraid they'd take it all away again." Grace smiled softly, brushing a tear from her daughter's cheek. "They already took it, but they couldn't take us. We survived." It was a healing moment, one that neither of them had expected, but one that they both needed. Lily, for the first time, felt a sense of belonging. She felt connected to the land, to the history her parents had carried with them for so long. It was as if, for the first time, she could see the full picture, the life her family had built here, the life that had been stolen, and the life that had endured despite everything. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the snow-covered land, the town of Copper Ridge began to shift, though slowly and painfully. Word of Lily's arrival had spread, and some of the townspeople, those who had remained silent during the initial confrontation, began to show signs of compassion. Some brought food, others brought handmade gifts, and even more brought apologies. The younger generation, who had never known the full story, began to ask questions. "Why do people do that?" a young teacher asked Samuel, the pain in his voice evident. "Why do they drive you out?" Samuel, with the wisdom of age and experience, replied, "Fear, and forgetting that we're all human." It was a moment of learning, of understanding that not everything was as simple as it seemed. As the days passed, the townspeople began to soften, and the tension that had once gripped Copper Ridge started to ease. The elders, who had been silent for so long, began to speak out, admitting their guilt and shame for what had happened. Even Wade Pritchard, who had once been one of the loudest voices against the Chins, began to waver. But it wasn't easy. Wade, unable to let go of his father's actions, still fought against the truth. He organized a group of men to ride to Cole's ranch, hoping to intimidate him into backing down. They rode through the snow-covered roads, their faces set in hard lines of anger. They demanded that Cole send Samuel and Grace away, that he give up on the idea of returning the land to its rightful owners. But Cole, standing firm, refused to back down. "They're staying as long as they want," he said, his voice unwavering. "And if you have a problem with that, you'll have to go through me." As the standoff continued, something incredible happened. Tom Carter, the blacksmith, who had long carried the weight of his guilt, stepped forward. His weathered hands, once strong with a hammer, now trembled as he raised them in defense of what was right. "Cole's right," he said, his voice cracking. "I watched them burn that cabin. I did nothing. I was wrong." And with that, the other men, some of whom had been part of the original mob, began to step forward one by one, admitting their role in the shameful event. The town, once so divided, began to heal. The very people who had once ostracized the Chins now stood beside them. The healing process was slow, but it was real. And it wasn't just about returning land. It was about returning dignity, about acknowledging the past, and making sure the mistakes of history were never repeated. The memorial to the Chun family was built, simple yet profound, with the original foundation stones preserved as a reminder of the land that had been stolen and the lives that had been saved. As the ceremony took place, Grace, now frail and weak, stood beside the memorial, planting an apple tree as a symbol of the new life that had sprung from the ashes of the old. "So something grows from what died," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The town gathered, not everyone but most of them, and as they stood together, Reverend Thomas offered a blessing. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," he said, his voice strong. But just as the ceremony was drawing to a close, Grace collapsed in her son's arms. The doctor was called, but it was too late. Grace's time had come. She had waited long enough to see the land she had lost returned, but now it was time for her to rest. As Samuel wept by her side, he knew that this was the final chapter of the journey his family had started all those years ago. Grace had lived to see the truth acknowledged, to see the land returned, and to see her daughter finally find peace. Grace's final moments arrived quietly as the dawn light filtered through the window of Cole's ranch house. The room was filled with a stillness that spoke of love, loss, and acceptance as the family gathered around her bed. Samuel, Lily, and Cole stood close, their hands gently holding hers, offering comfort in the final hours of her life. Grace had always been a pillar of strength, but now she was a fragile, tired woman at peace with the life she had lived and the memories she would leave behind. Despite her frailty, her eyes shone with gratitude as she turned to Cole. "You gave us peace," she whispered softly, the weight of her words resonating deeply. "You let us matter again." Her voice trembled, but it was filled with love and an unspoken thank you. As she spoke to Lily, her voice grew fainter, but still carried that maternal warmth. "Don't be afraid to put roots down. The land remembers kindness." Lily, now a young woman, leaned in closer, the weight of the words settling on her heart. Grace's hand gently squeezed Lily's. It was the final piece of guidance she would ever give her daughter. Her last wish for Lily to build a future, to find belonging, and to make peace with the past. As the light of dawn grew stronger, Grace took her last breath, a peaceful expression settling on her face. Samuel looked at his wife one last time, tears welling in his eyes. "She died on land that was ours," he said softly. "That's all she wanted." The family took solace in knowing that Grace had passed in a place that she had once called home, the land she and Samuel had built together so many years ago. Grace was buried near the memorial, the land now sacred to them and to the town. It was a simple ceremony with a wooden cross carved by Tom Carter, marking her resting place. The whole town was invited, and the turnout was surprisingly large. Even Wade Pritchard, who had been so adamant against the Chin's return, stood at a distance, observing the ceremony, his face hard but his stance softening ever so slightly. After the service, Wade approached Samuel, his hat in hand. "My father was wrong," Wade said quietly. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was an acknowledgement of the past, and that was more than Samuel had ever expected. He nodded, his voice quiet but sincere. "Thank you." The town's redemption was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a reality, slowly but surely. Lily, now standing beside her father and Cole, looked out at the crowd. She had never imagined that her life could turn out like this. She had come to this land as a stranger, uncertain of her place in the world. But as she stood there, surrounded by the people who had once turned their backs on her family, she felt a shift within herself. This was her land, her mother's land, and she wasn't going to abandon it again. She made the decision to stay, to put down roots where her family had once flourished. Cole, with his usual steadiness, offered her a partnership on the land. "We'll work it together," he said, "as equals." Lily smiled, nodding in agreement. "But as equals," she added, a firm resolve in her voice. Together, they would build the future her mother had dreamed of. The town, with all its flaws, was beginning to change. It had taken time, but the truth had found its way into the hearts of many. The healing had begun, and it wasn't just about the land. It was about people accepting their past, acknowledging their wrongs, and striving for a better future. In the following months, Samuel's health declined rapidly. But before he passed, he spent his final days watching over the land, sharing stories with Cole, and teaching him the traditions of his people. It was during these quiet moments that Samuel revealed the depth of his gratitude. "You changed more than you know, Cole," he said one evening, sitting on the porch of the new cabin, watching the sunset. "You changed what this town believed about itself." Those words lingered long after Samuel was gone. Samuel lived just long enough to see the cabin completed, a symbol of both his family's return and the town's shift toward redemption. The once divided town had come together, at least in part, to support Lily and her vision for the future. The children of Copper Ridge, curious about the past, often visited the Chins to hear their story. Samuel had become a living memorial, and as time passed, his memory was honored by the very people who had once sought to erase it. As the years went by, the town's collective memory began to change. Grace's passing marked the beginning of a new chapter for Copper Ridge, one where the past could no longer be ignored, and where the wrongs of the past could be acknowledged, even if they couldn't be undone. The anniversary of Grace's death became an annual event, where the community would gather at the apple tree to remember what had been lost and what had been gained. The memorial became a focal point, a place where people could reflect on the past and look to the future with hope. One year after Grace's death, the town held another ceremony. The apple tree, which had been planted in her honor, was now in full bloom, its branches heavy with fruit. The children read from the history project that had been created in the Chin's honor, a testament to the power of storytelling and the importance of preserving history. The young rancher who had proposed to Lily was now part of the town's future, and together, they worked to make Copper Ridge a place where people from all walks of life could thrive. As the ceremony came to a close, Cole stood at the edge of the crowd, content but humble. He had done what he knew was right, and now the town was beginning to find its way. But even as the town was healing, the cycle of kindness continued. Another winter night, another blizzard, and another elderly couple arrived at Cole's door, lost and in need of shelter. Without hesitation, Cole opened the door, welcoming them inside. As they entered, a photograph on the mantel caught their eye. It was the picture of Samuel, Grace, Lily, and Cole, taken during the dedication of the new cabin. The elderly couple looked at it, and Lily's voice echoed softly in the room. "Uncle Cole taught me that kindness isn't just about the moment," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of the years that had passed. "It's about what comes after. It's about facing hard truths, choosing right over easy, and believing people can change." As the travelers settled in for the night, the camera pulled back to show the full extent of the ranch, the land, the house, the memorial tree, and the community that had been forever changed. The legacy of Samuel and Grace Chan would live on, not just in the land, but in the hearts of the people who had learned to embrace the truth and stand for what was right.